Yeah, it's recording.
Okay, good.
So does anybody else see that box on their screen?
Yeah, you must have something on your screen, Kerry, for the presentation.
That one?
Yeah, there
Yeah, it's gone now.
There must be a way. Isn't there a way of doing? Oh, it's down the bottom. I found it now. That's it. Okay. Found it. All right. I'm not in. I don't know when to start. I have gone into some of the others, and they normally start a few minutes afterwards. So wait till that come on. Is anybody having a? Can you see it if others? No, they won't let them on. It's too early. They won't let anyone on. They're very strict about the timing of all this.
Yeah, they let them in with a minute to go.
Yeah. Okay. The tea dump.
He'll also make sure his.
Hello, Juliet. Hello, Suzanne. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hello, Jeanette. Morning, afternoon, good night.
Just become afternoon here.
And where are you from?
British Columbia, Canada.
Hmm?
British Columbia.
So it's afternoon there.
Well, just at noon.
Okay, so we'll wait a few minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
Who chose that location?
Okay, Vanessa, I think we'll wait one more minute. Can you hear me, Vanessa?
Yes, I can hear you, Kerry. Okay, we'll wait one more minute then.
No, let people get in. I was pretty impressed with the fact that it was full, and it was full yesterday.
Mhm.
Okay, I think we should start. Vanessa, would you like to introduce the speakers?
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and welcome to our presentation on reimagining the policing of gender-based violence. What can the world learn from women's police stations? Today we have presenting Kerry Carrington, who's from Professor Kerry Carrington, who's. Did you want to go to the next slide, Kerry?
Oh yes, sorry.
That's okay, not a problem. Yeah, so we have Professor Kerry Carrington, who's from the QUT Centre for Justice with Queensland University of Technology, Australia. We also have Professor Myrna Dawson, who's from the Centre for the Study of Social and Legal Responses to Violence from the University of Guelph in Canada. We also have Dr. Elaine Arnull, who's and Dr. Mahuya Kanjilal, who's from the Institute and Society and Community, University of Wolverhampton in the UK, and also Dr. Jacqueline Sebire, who's from the Bedshire Police in the UK.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm just going to provide some background to the study that we all have done. The first part of the study was field research in the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina. There's 15 million people live there. Now, it's important to understand that in Spanish, these specialist police stations that are designed to receive victims of gender violence are called Comisarias de la Mujer y Familia, which means police for women and families. They're not women-only police stations. That's how they've been mistranslated into English. Now, they were established in 1988, 32 years ago, and in the year when we did our research, they had 2,300 police officers plus a number of civilians. They responded to nearly 250,000 reports of domestic violence and over 7,000 reports of sexual violence. Can I just ask people to put their screens on mute when they come in? Thank you very much. Okay, so as I've already said, the first one was established in La Plata in 1988. Now, they had a rapid increase over the last 10 years. They've seen many more, and by 2019 they had 131, which means that in that province, 1 in 5 police stations is a specialist police station designed just to receive gender violence. And they have their own report structure. They report to their own command, their own hierarchy, and their own commissioner, and then they report up to the minister. So you have the common police here, and you have these specialised police stations here, and that was absolutely fundamentally important. And that was because they had to design these stations to be completely separate from the common police, because the common police were involved in the disappearances, abductions, rape and murder of many thousands of young people, but especially women in Argentina in the military dictatorship. So in this period of redemocratization, they had a truth commission, and out of that truth commission, they asked the victims and the survivors, what do you want? And they said, well, we would never go to a common police station for an issue to do with gender violence. So this is how they emerged. Now, in 2009, Argentina passed this protection law to prevent, punish and eradicate violence against women. They established a national action plan. In 2012, they established the offence of femicide, which is the deliberate killing of a woman. It's like and it carries a heavier penalty than other forms of murder. They have a gender policy unit within the Ministry of Security, as well, as I said, and these particular command structures, they report up that hierarchy. And they also have local boards in all the communities where these police stations come together with their local members. So what did we do? Okay, so it took me 3 years to get permission from the Ministry of Security in Argentina and 3 visits, but I finally got permission. It took a couple of years to get the funding, Australian Research Council funding. I should actually acknowledge my partner, and this is from Argentina, Professor Maximo Solso, who's not here today. And we got a Research Council grant of $228,000 from Australia to conduct this research. So the first stage, we all the research is conducted in Spanish and translated into English, and we have a website with everything in Spanish and English. We traveled 2,500 kilometres across the province because we did our research in 10 of these specialist police stations, and they were representative of the sort of rural, regional, city, coastal regions of the province. And we interviewed 100 of the employees, 90% of whom were female, 19 male, and there were 17, so most of them were police officers and the others were the multidisciplinary teams. Now, it's important to understand that they operate as a one-stop shop. So when a victim or a survivor goes into these police stations, they're welcomed. It's like walking into a living room. You see their converted houses, most of them. They're very colourful, they're very inviting, they're very warm. They're welcomed by a civilian, and then they're sort of triaged at the beginning. Do you want to see a lawyer, a counsellor, a police officer, a doctor? And so that's how, so they don't walk in and immediately see a police officer. They see some, and they also have spaces for children, and they offer childcare as well. So they're very inviting, they're welcoming, they're chalk and cheese, they're the complete opposite to how our police stations in Australia look, which are designed to receive offenders, not victims, which almost make and designed to make people feel guilty when they walk in the door. And certainly in Australia, most of our police are male, so it's very, and most of the victims are female, so it's very difficult for them to choose to report to a female. So what we discovered in our first stage, and you can find out all the detailed findings of this on our project page, is that they're designed to work with victims to prevent and perpetrators to prevent re-victimisation. They don't have holding cells. They work with the common police, and when the common police are the ones who do the arrests and who carry out that work, but they do work with victims to break the cycle. They do not see it as incident-based policing; it's trust-based policing, and they have a very complex understanding of what gender violence is, and they define it they define it as inclusive of reproductive abuse as well as physical abuse, symbolic abuse. They actually have a much more complicated definition of what domestic violence is. They don't call it coercive control. They just call it a cycle that may involve all these forms of abuse. Now, interestingly, 2/3 of those who seek their assistance do not want a criminal justice solution, and they're not, and women and victims are not funneled into the criminal justice system. It's only if they choose that. Importantly, they don't take their agency from them. They are empowered to decide what they want. And that means that they're not just immediately funneled or have to be funneled into the criminal justice to get support. So they actually then provide women and victims with a wide access to an array of supports that without having to make a formal complaint. So that's one way they do it. They also send perpetrators off to what they call centres to unlearn violence. They have this view that men who are violent are the problem. not women who are the victims or men who are the victims or transgender people who are the victims. And so the problem is them and their behaviour, and they have sentenced for men or perpetrators to unlearn their violence. And that's because they take this view that violence it's a very complicated view as well, that violence is in fact socially constructed, and that men learn how to become violent primarily from peer groups and other men, and they see gender violence as very much something created by the societies in which we view. Now, they also work with local organisations to prevent gender violence, and they are mandated to do prevention work under that particular law. And that means that once a month, at a minimum, they go into the community and they engage in prevention. Now, that prevention work they're very innovative. It could be a whole range of things. I'll just give you one example. If they for example, they had a problem with religion and Catholicism, preaching that women were second citizens and that men and husbands could own their wives and that violence in the family was a private matter, they had to counter that norm across their society. So how did they do it? Where they discovered there were preachers or priests or religious ministers who were preaching that to their congregations, they would go to those congregations and stand outside on a Sunday morning, and they would hand out, no, domestic violence is a crime, it's not normal, no. And they would completely counter that, and then they would say, you need help, come and see us. And they wouldn't stop doing that until that preacher stopped preaching that. So that's just one example, but they do so many other fascinating and innovative forms of prevention work. Have a look at it on the website. So what was the next stage? The next stage, and this is where my collaborators, Elaine from the UK, and Professor Myrna Dawson from Canada, and Jackie from the UK as well. This is where we thought, well, what can we learn? And the whole project is informed by the view that there's much that English-speaking countries can learn from the global South, much that we can learn from other countries to improving how we police gender violence. Now, it's important to note that Argentina was the site that created, it's a very innovative society. It's ranked much higher than Australia for gender equity, and it's done that in one generation. And it established what was called a truth commission in the aftermath of the brutality of the military dictatorship. And in that truth commission, they asked the victims' survivors what they wanted, and this is one of the creations that happened to heal and to go forward. So we take the view that there's much that you can learn, and the whole of the world used that model. It's called transitional justice. South Africa used it to deal with post-apartheid. We used truth commissions to deal with removal of children. So that whole idea of transitional justice came from Argentina. It's a very innovative, forward-thinking country, and there's much we can learn from it.
So I'm leaving you a message to please give me a call back. I'd like to talk to you about...
Speaking, whoever's got their phone on, all them, can you please mute your phone or your thank you. Okay, so what did we do? Okay, so what we did was we designed a survey, and it was broken down into several parts. Of course, we collected demographic information. Then we really wanted to get at the key perceptions of mainly the workers and the police who work in this field in Australia, United Kingdom, and Canada. What do they think? Do they think that this idea could work in their country, and what aspects could work and why? And so we asked some very specific questions, and we also asked questions about their other ideas around how we can improve the policing of gender violence. So the first one of these questions was, in your opinion, now they were shown a video, and the video went for I think 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, and they were shown all those aspects that I just described to you. They were shown how these particular police stations operate, and after watching that video, they were then asked you know, which one of these aspects do you think could improve how police stations in your country, in Australia, Canada, or UK, could improve the response to victims of gender-based violence? We asked these 12 aspects that are on the screen. I won't go through them because we're going to now show you the results. So we asked, so what we did was we chunked down the critical aspects of how these police stations operate. And then we asked, well, do you think the police in your country could benefit if they did the same? And then the second key question we asked is, well, in an ideal world, how would you like police to respond to victims of gender violence or survivors? And we asked them these 5 statements: allow victims to choose a female police officer if they were a victim of male violence, empower victims to leave a violent partner, help victims to simply remove an offender rather than go down a criminal justice path, listen to victim stories without judging, and work from a gender perspective. Okay, here's the Australian study, and I'm going to hand over to Vanessa. Vanessa, you're going to report the key findings. Well, Vanessa, you're going to do this statement?
Oh, is this okay? So in the survey we had. This is just the survey we're talking about at the moment, not the findings. So
yeah, that's the survey.
You want me to do this part as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So we had two surveys. So in the workforce survey, we asked 17 questions plus 1 open questions. Participants were recruited through Qualtrics and through various peak bodies, through to Australian universities, the Australian and New Zealand Policing Advisory Agency. We had our survey open from the 12th of March 2019 to the 26th of October 2019. And we ended up with 277 complete responses from that survey. There's responses that were incomplete. Unfortunately, we had to disregard. From that, we will go into the survey findings later on in the discussion. But of these people, 63% of the people had worked in the domestic and family violence sector for more than 6 years. So there was a lot of experience, and we could get a good understanding from their perspective about what they thought. We also had a community survey, which was open to the Australian community. Go back a slide, Kerry. That's okay. So this reached a far wider, a lot of people. This survey was just a little bit different. We asked 15 questions plus 3 open-ended questions. We recruited our participants via Facebook ads and had a good response. This survey was open from 25th of September to 26th of October 2019. And we ended up with 566 complete responses. And of these participants, 47% had worked in the domestic and family violence sector for more than 6 years.
Hi, this is Peggy, Sue's neighbor, Sue Grivel.
Could anyone who's not talking please mute their microphones, please, because we get the feedback over our discussion. Thank you. Do you want me to talk about the demographics, Kerry?
I think we need to move a bit quickly now. Okay,
Sure.
so here's the demographics, but basically the most important thing to note is that 98% of those involved in the workforce were directly involved in responding to and preventing gender violence, and that 80% of them in the Australian context have worked with Indigenous. So that was really, really important. We had it for us and for our context. Okay. Canadian survey. Myrna, would you like to take over now?
Thanks, Kerry. So like many countries, Canada has witnessed a growing discontent with police, especially with respect to violence against women and girls and for Indigenous and racialized populations. And I think similar to many countries, some of this discontent has grown from things like police use of deadly force in various situations that have been publicly criticized or questioned, documentation of ongoing problematic responses or lack of responses to violence against women and gender-based violence, and then incidents of police officers' own use of violence against women, whether it's sexual assault or violence against female partners, and the lack of responses by policing agencies. And we know that there's research that has shown that there's higher risk of domestic violence and intimate partner violence in policing populations compared to general populations. In particular, in the Canadian context, the release of the National Inquiry Report into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in 2019, so almost 2 years ago, highlighted specific concerns with police responses to Indigenous communities and in particular Indigenous women and girls. And therefore, we were particularly interested in the receptiveness to different forms of policing or community-based responses for this population as well. And clearly, as Kerry mentioned, this is also an issue for Australia. So I was aware of the use of police stations for women experiencing violence, but became more so because of Kerry's work in Argentina and her subsequent exploration of the utility in the global north. So I wanted to explore their potential in Canada. Next slide, please, Kerry. So early in 2020, so about a year ago, we replicated the Australian Community Survey in Canada with the similar set of questions. We had both an English and a French survey, recognizing that we're a bilingual country. We recruited through social media, primarily Twitter, research websites, listservs, and networks. The survey was open from the last week of January to the end of April, and it resulted in completed surveys from 570 respondents, 63% of which had 6 or more years working in sectors related to violence against women. So I'm just going to quickly run through basic demographics because you can see them here on the screen as well. As expected, the vast majority of survey respondents were female, 86% of the sample. 1 in 4 identified as a member of a culturally and linguistically diverse community. 1 in 12 identified their background as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. This was smaller than we had hoped because, as I mentioned, Indigenous populations were a primary population of interest for us in the survey, and we'll come back to some of that in a moment. Almost 40% of the respondents were from Ontario, which was expected since it's our most populous province. Just want to note that the only province that was underrepresented was Quebec, and this is potentially because of the fact that we have language barriers, but again, we did have a French survey. Half of the respondents lived in a major urban area, but over a third in smaller cities or towns, and about 14% in rural areas. As you can see, the vast majority of survey respondents reported that their work did involve responding to and preventing gender-based violence. And you can see the distribution of their professional or voluntary capacity or research capacity in the chart, the bar chart below that figure. Of the 570 responses, 3 out of 5, or 60%, worked with First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities or agencies. 1/3 of the respondents worked in the role or a similar related role for more than 15 years, compared to the next largest group, which had less than 3 years experience. And 1 in 4 survey respondents were between 41 and 50 years of age, and the next largest group was between 31 and 40 years of age. Over to UK.
Elaine, it's over to you.
Thank you. So I first heard about this actually when I saw Kerry present this work at CSW 63. So, and we started talking then about doing this work and looking at that in the UK with Jackie, who's also presenting today. So this, interestingly, has come very much to the fore since we launched the survey, and just last week when we had the disappearance of a young woman in the UK for whom a male police officer has now been arrested and charged with her murder. So for us, the two things came very much to the fore, both violence against women and policing. At the vigil for her, there was then the arrest of women and the intervention of police in that, which then has caused a very large debate that goes beyond policing into thinking about women and the way that crime is dealt with in the UK that involves women, because we have an incredibly low conviction rate for rape, for example, but also then about attitude to women generally in society and within the police force in particular. So it's brought this study very much to the fore, and we're interested to see, because we're live at the moment, whether we get different responses after those incidents than because the survey actually opened ahead of that. Kerry, next slide, please. So we are still live. So all of our work is only done on the first 167 responses that we're talking about today. We had 17 questions, so we had 2 more than Australia and Canada because we've got 2 questions about COVID as well, because we went live during the COVID period as well. People have been recruited via direct email, so that's people that we already have contact with via the university, and Jackie has put it through all police forces for us. We also tweet about it regularly and take every opportunity we can to promote the fact that this work is going on. We opened in the 15th of January and we're still open, and we will stay open until we have 500 responses, which we don't have yet. We have 167, as I said so far. Sorry, Kerry.
Sorry.
That's all right. And 67% have more than 6 years work experience. So we've got a very experienced responding group, as with the other studies. It's Mahuya now.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. Yeah, socio-demographic distribution of respondents shows that within 167 responses we have so far, that female participants actually responded in majority, and ethnic background wise, majority of our responses came from British white background, and 11.5% they responders are identified them as coming from Black and ethnic minority background. And age-wise, more than half of the respondents aged between 40 and 60, and 1/3 are below aged 40. And nearly half of our survey respondents stated that they predominantly work with white British survey users, and more than 1/3 of the participants work with mixed ethnicity, and only a small number work with Black and ethnic minority service users only. And we had responses from a diverse work background, and 38% comprises either domestic abuse and sexual violence support worker or police. And we also had good responses from social workers, victim support workers, independent domestic violence advisors, and independent sexual violence advisors. And as Elaine just mentioned, that over 67% of survey respondents have more than 6 years experience in their job. Actually, nearly half of them have more than 10% and 10 years of experience in their job. So they're quite experienced. And geographically, largest participants came from Manchester, Liverpool, Bedfordshire, and West Midlands area. And we have other responses from London, Oxfordshire, Derbyshire, Shropshire. So yeah, next slide.
Okay, I think it's over to you now, Vanessa.
Yes, that's right. So these are the findings. So these are the findings from the 3 countries. So we looked at the doing a comparison about the question 1, which asked which aspects of women's police stations could improve how police stations respond to victims of gender violence. To note in making these comparisons is that they're obviously just observed comparisons, and in the Australian survey, 24% of the respondents who answered this question actually worked in the DFE sector. In the Canadian survey, 87% work in the DFE sector, and the majority of the 167 respondents in the UK today work in the DFE sector. So there is a difference in the response rates from a workforce perspective. Overall, though, Australia showed support for 11 of the 12 aspects, with responses varying between 56 to 86%. Canada showed stronger support for 11 of the aspects, with their responses varying between 66 to 89%. And currently, the UK shows support for 9 of the aspects, with the responses varying between 58% to 82%. Collectively, these countries show positive support for 9 of the 12 aspects, which are working in multidisciplinary teams, collaborate with local agencies, provide emergency support, design to receive victims, provide childcare, prevention work in the community, interview room for victims, work with offenders to break the cycle, and work with victims to break the cycle. The most endorsed aspect by Australian and Canadian responders was work in multidisciplinary teams with lawyers, counsellors and social workers with 86% and 89% support, while the most endorsed aspect by the UK to date is specially designed interview rooms for victims with 82% support. Now, the most observed similarity for the 3 countries was the aspect provide emergency support to victims of violence, and that ranged between 75 to 81%. However, there were notable differences across the countries. The least endorsed aspect with significantly lower response rates was both similar for Australian and Canadian respondents, was for the aspect operate from houses in the suburbs with 41 and 40%, while the UK also showed a lower response rate for this aspect. However, the aspect staffed predominantly by female police officers was slightly lower with 33% support. This aspect also showed the largest observed difference across all 3 countries, which was supported by 66% of Canadian respondents, 56% of Australian, and 33% of the UK respondents. Similarly, work from a gender perspective had a diversity of responses, with 74% of Canadian respondents, 62% of Australian respondents, and 40% of UK respondents. Okay, over to Kerry now. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, all right. Okay, so now the second key set of questions were around ideally how should the police respond to victims of gender-based violence. Okay, and the first was allow female victims of male violence to choose a female officer to receive their complaint. The reason this is so important is that currently within our countries, because of the male dominance of policing, that is a practicality that's just not possible to most female victims of male violence in Canada, Australia and the UK. And if you can see that the results here, the results were very strongly agree. Basically, overwhelmingly, very strong support from Australia, Canada and UK. And there are only a very few, less than 10% who disagreed with that statement. And I think that goes to the nub of the problem, and that policing is still fundamentally male-dominated, whereas the victims of gender violence are fundamentally female. Now, we don't have data from the UK yet, so we asked to listen to victim stories without judging. Again, absolutely massive support here. We strongly agree and agreeing, and less than a couple percent not agreeing. So that's absolutely overwhelming. But when you compare that with the current research on policing, most victims' experiences with policing is that they feel like they're not heard or listened to. Okay. The next one was work from a gender perspective that understands domestic violence is a cycle. And again, overwhelming support. We only have data from Australia and Canada. Again, and this is really important in the context of the proposals for coercive control legislation, because at the moment, as far as I understand, certainly within Australian context, space, and therefore there's a huge...
Kerry, we're losing your audio. Kerry, we're losing your audio.
Oh, sorry.
I think it's when you put your head away from the camera. I think if you street direct to the camera, we might hear you better.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So that was, wait a minute, I'll just put on my headphones. Can you hear me now? Better. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So that's a very significant finding because our laws don't generally allow it's incident-based policing rather than policing from a gender perspective that understands that it's a pattern. Now, again, absolutely overwhelming endorsement that police should be able to help victims to simply remove offenders from the home. Now, this is something that happens in Argentina. They don't need to go down a criminal justice response for this to happen. And then again, empower victims to leave a violent partner. Once again, absolutely overwhelming support from Australia and Canada. We don't have the data from England yet. And now we're going to open it up for discussion. And I think it's now over to Elaine, and I'm going to try and figure out why the speaker has moved. So hang on, Elaine, this was your slide, wasn't it?
We contributed to it anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
It is mine. Okay, so I think really quite interestingly, we didn't get many responses to, as you'll see, because Kerry couldn't give them, to the questions around gender-based violence and things like that, but we got lots of qualitative responses. And actually the responses about whether women's police stations work from Australia, Canada and the UK, as you'll see, are really similar across the three countries, with Australian domestic violence worker saying that they think that 25 years have passed and we still haven't got it right, and the idea could be worth a pilot. In Canada, people said they love the idea of women's police stations with gender-based violence being so rooted in gender inequality, and again thinking it would be a contribution to addressing gender-based violence at local levels. And as I say, when asked to tick the question, people didn't respond to it in the UK, but then in the qualitative responses, we had really positive responses to the issue of gender-based violence and whether women's police stations could work with that, and people saying, I really think female police stations would be effective, that people would feel more comfortable, and it would be an important way to address gender-based violence in a way that didn't try and fit everybody into a one-size-fits-all approach. So again, quite an interesting similarity across the three nations, even though in the UK at the moment people aren't answering the quant question for reasons we don't understand.
Okay, now it's over to you, Myrna.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, we're just focusing on a selection of the qualitative comments. And I mentioned earlier that a particular interest in Canada was the perception of the utility of these initiatives in Indigenous communities. And so here, you know, we looked at the question about staffing and who should staff women's police stations, because as Kerry noted, it's commonly assumed that it's only women, but it can be a variety of actors. It's the training that's important and the approach. It's not the gender or the race ethnicity necessarily. But we asked this question of the 48 Indigenous responses, and we focused only on the Indigenous responses because it's important to let them decide and indicate what they think would be most appropriate for their communities. And so as you can see, the largest group here felt that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous women and men, so a combination of both men and women and both Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations would be best, with 27% of the sample of the 48 responses supporting that, followed by those who felt Indigenous and non-Indigenous women only would be the more appropriate response. And again, 1 in 5 had no opinion. The overarching sort of implications of some of the quotes, and you see some of the quotes here, however, is that it's a complex issue and it depends on a variety of factors. But one of the key priorities, I think, that was resonated in the qualitative responses, both from the 48 as well as the non-Indigenous responses, that it had to be Indigenous determined, so it had to be self-determination. And there was a strong belief that it had to be Indigenous women-led. I think that's it for that slide, Kerry, so we can move on.
Okay. Okay, Jackie, it's over to you.
You're on mute, Jackie.
So you wait all that time, don't you? And then you miss it. Hi, everyone. So my name's Jackie Sebire, and I am an Assistant Chief Constable in Bedfordshire in the UK. And I'm also the National Police Lead for Violence and Vulnerability. And I'm ever so grateful to Kerry and Elaine for allowing me to get involved in this such important research. But the issue for me is, so what? So what do we do with all of this research? What do we do with what the survey tells us? And for me, this is such a critical time for policing. We've got the intersectionality of so many issues at the moment. We have Black Lives Matter, race, the right to protest against health and safety issues, and now increasingly violence against women and girls, and women feeling very, very unsafe on the streets. But these are really, really deep-seated chronic social issues. And they are being looked at, these social issues for me are being looked at through a crime lens to try and solve. So, and policing are battling with, we have very traditional enforcement roles around arrest, protection, dealing with public safety. But then how do we marry that up with that increasing demand for us to have this skill set around mental health, around vulnerability, around understanding people's lived experience? And it's not a happy marriage at the moment for policing, trying to deal with all of this. And I think this is really, really evident in what the survey is telling us, because what the survey is telling us, I think, is we need to do something different. We really need to reimagine, as the title says, how we are dealing with gender-based policing. And look at what the different skill sets police officers need and how we can best serve the community and best keep women and girls, make them feel safe at the home, in public spaces and in private. And it's telling us, again, what's really interesting is whilst the contexts are very different from Buenos Aires to Canada to the UK, there's some real similar voices and strengths of voices coming out. And we really, really must, as police officers and police leaders, listen to what's being said in the survey. Now, in the UK, we do have safe spaces. We have sexual offence referral centres, which are where victims of sexual crimes can come in safe environments. And I looked at the pictures of Buenos Aires. They're very similar. They're bright, they're colourful, full of like soft furnishings. They're safe places. They don't feel like the austere police stations and examination suites I certainly grew up with and learned about. And we are certainly investing in and trying to improve how we deal with interviews with victims, and how when they come and give their video evidence, which we're moving towards more often than not, how we can make sure that they don't walk through that same front door that suspects walk through. But it's really difficult because we are stuck with very old Victorian estate buildings, or these big police buildings on the edge of industrial estates. So how do we deal with our estate strategy and our violence strategy? How do we bring them together? And for me, what this survey is telling us, and what I think will continue to tell us, is that what works is this multi-agency hub. So having police who are able to be compassionate and understand the lived experience, working with those specialist teams, whether it's mental health, substance misuse, housing, lawyers, having them work together to address in a bespoke way women and girls violence and women and girls vulnerability is the way to go forward. But that will only happen if we've got joined up leadership, listening to this sort of research and the other research we know out there, and having joined up strategies and action plans. And when I say action plans, we can have as many action plans as you want, but actually they've actually got to deliver action. So for me, I think it's really, really important. And that's why I've been so supportive of this survey, pushing it out through my contacts and through the policing networks that we have, to really understand what the problems is, and more importantly, what the solutions are. So I'm like, again, I think it's really, really important we continue to build on this research and listen to what those voices are telling us.
Well, thank you, Jackie. That was awesome. And I'm so delighted that you're part of our research team and that you are there listening. I'm so delighted. Thank you. You can hear me, can you? Yes, yes. Okay, I don't know why I've disappeared, but okay. So the last slides are simply about the recommendations that Myrna and I feel comfortable to come up with. It's too early for the UK data, although the indications are very similar thus far. But we think that as a byproduct, if there were multidisciplinary hubs created to specially receive victims of gendered violence, um, we think that this could also very significantly improve the careers of women and police who want to also enter this type of policing. And we also think it could solve another problem, and that there's obviously police who do not want to be part of this. And so it could be a win-win solution for all, and that they can then focus on the crimes they want to focus on. And I think that's also something that a lot of police struggle with, because certainly we've discovered that there's a deep resentment from a lot of police who are mostly male, young, white, who join up to do policing because they want to chase bank robbers, or they want to, but they don't want to go to domestics. So it's a real problem, and I think this is a win-win for all. So we're just recommending a trial. Now, a trial is not inexpensive, and you don't have of these specialised multidisciplinary justice centres or specialised police stations. Then they do have to have police, but they have to have social workers. And instead of police having to have all these skill sets, as Jackie suggested, if they worked in multidisciplinary teams, we can then lower our expectations of what we expect police to deliver. I mean, they're not trained trauma-informed counsellors. So, but they could certainly, their response could be significantly enhanced if they worked alongside that. But it would also relieve police of having to feel that they have to be everything to everybody. I think that's that kind of frustration. So we sense that as well. But certainly the victim-friendly interview rooms, that's a no-brainer. I mean, I think Jackie just hit the nail on the head when she said, it's very difficult having suspects enter the same door as victims and sitting in the same waiting rooms as alleged victims, and it's a recipe for trauma for everybody concerned. Of course, childcare emergency support, collaborating with local agencies. Now, that should just be a no-brainer, but we have a whole lot of privacy laws that make that near impossible at the moment. And because we have, our welfare systems and our policing systems and our health systems siloed, the whole lot of information sharing doesn't happen. But if it did happen on a systematic basis, we might be able to prevent a whole lot of women and others from being murdered or killed, or having to continue to sustain violence. Now, of course, community prevention activities. Now, that's for everybody. Policing should be part of this because it sends a very strong message, but that is a responsibility that certainly the police in Buenos Aires, they share that, and they share that with all the local government communities within their particular locale. So that's about building this, what they call trust-based policing model. And of course, working with victims and offenders now, and not just having an incident focus. Unfortunately, our criminal law has an incident focus, which means it's easy to misidentify, too easy to misidentify who are the victims and who are the offenders. And unfortunately, in Australian context, that's led to a massive overrepresentation of Indigenous women as perpetrators who've ended up in jail. 66% of women in jail in Queensland for breaches of domestic violence are Indigenous. They only represent 3% of the population. So we have really got to fix that. Now, support survivors groups. Now, the police don't run these survivors groups, but when they are attached to these multidisciplinary hubs, they become a safe space, a safe place that victims and survivors can come and use, and it's their counsellors who they work with who assist these, and of course, I know that it's very difficult, but certainly within Australia, police as first responders are just simply not adequately trained. They're not even expected to have a degree, so they don't do social work, they don't do trauma-informed counselling. So I mean, how is it that we don't expect every other profession is professionalized. You have to have a degree, you have to have a profession to be a nurse, to be doctors, to be teachers, but we certainly don't have that in Australia, and that's a real problem. So what you have is the first responders, some sort of 18-year-old young guy or straight out of high school. It just doesn't work. Okay, and the last one is that we are suggesting that if these multidisciplinary centres adopted simply a set of protocols for basically respectful treatment, and I know this should sound obvious, and we know that this should happen routinely, but all the research, certainly on police in Australia, shows us that our police don't do this. Show empathy and respect for victims, listen to their stories without adjusting them, helping them remove offenders, support repeat victims, work from a gender perspective, empowering victims to live, and allow victims of malviolence to choose a female police officer. That is just not possible within an Australian context, because most of our police on the front line are male, and in rural and regional areas and Indigenous communities, they're nearly all male. And to reinforce Myrna's point about Indigenousness, in the Australian setting, in Indigenous communities, they just simply have to be Indigenous-led. Look, I'll thank you now, and I'll hand over to Vanessa to handle the questions. I think there's a button where you can ask questions of the team.
Yeah, so you're more than welcome to ask any questions in the chat area, and we can have a look at those for you.
Perhaps while we're waiting for some questions to form, I can just sort of pick up on a couple of things that Kerry said in the Canadian context that I think are worth repeating. First of all, a lot of the qualitative comments that came out in our interview underscored the need for a trauma-informed lens and a trauma-informed response. And I think that's really key. And I think if you think about the situations in which the police themselves are responding to, police officers could benefit from having trauma-informed training, not just with responding to victims, but with respect to their own sort of responses to what's happening. The other thing is around training. I absolutely agree that it would be good to have some sort of professional type of degree, but I know lots of people with degrees that would still not be good to respond to people with gender-based issues or gender-based violence experiences. So it's about the full collaboration and the full and equal collaboration with other people with expertise in this, such as the violence against women sector, because we're still left with a hierarchy where the police are sort of here and other agencies are here, and it's about leveling out that full collaboration. So I just wanted to bring in those 2 points.
Okay.
Thanks, Myrna. Oh, sorry, I was going to say we do have some questions here. So one of the questions that has been asked is, what kind of support is this study getting from higher levels of police forces? For example, what is the RCMP saying about this in Canada?
So I'm not sure what the RCMP is saying about this in Canada. We have had no contact with the RCMP with respect to the survey itself. They could have been some responses, but we wouldn't necessarily know that. We would just know that they were in the policing sector. The RCMP has been dealing with some issues. There's been a couple of reports come out recently with respect to their responses with respect to female police officers within their own institutions. So I know that there's a lot of discussions taking place about systemic sexism and systemic discrimination within the RCMP, but having said anything specifically about this survey, I'm not aware of anything.
And I think from the UK, I think hopefully my presence here tonight and that, you know, I've been working obviously with Elaine and Kerry since the beginning. So in terms of the UK, there is certainly full support for sharing the survey. Not everyone agrees with the content of the results, and it's obviously prompted some interesting debates. But in terms of the importance of the survey and understanding what the evidence tells us, it's got full support from the most senior level. So I don't know if anyone I picked up at the beginning. I'm the National Police Chief's lead for violence and vulnerability. I've been sharing it with the national leads for domestic abuse. So again, full support for the survey from a UK's perspective.
Can I just say bravo to the UK and bravo to you? There's a question here in the chat. What is the response from ANSPA? That's the Australian sort of advisory group to all the police services in Australia. Australia has 8 of them because there's 8 states. Unfortunately, ANSPA, I did invite them to support the survey, but they declined. And I approached every single police force in Australia. There are 8 of them. Queensland rejected it. I've got all these rejection letters. The only 3 police forces that are supportive of the survey was Tasmania, Western Australia, and the Australian Capital Territory, ACT. So all the others absolutely declined. They didn't want to be. So that's a real shame. And I keep inviting them in, and I keep trying, but they don't particularly want to listen, I don't think. So somebody says, there's another chat. It says, I came in a bit late. How does legal aid for victims handled in such settings? Yes, certainly in those multidisciplinary centres within Argentina, they all have lawyers. That's the lawyers are supplied and paid for. So the women get access to free legal support. Okay. There's another chat here. Was there any discussion of feminist analysis here in Canada with the mass shooting? That one's for you, I think, Myrna.
I guess the only thing I would say here was I would pick up on a comment that Kerry made earlier, that part of even having this discussion around police stations for women is about recognizing that there will be some police officers that potentially would never end up in a police station for women, that they don't want to deal with these issues. And so that's recognizing that we have misogyny in what are traditional patriarchal institutions, which are the origins of policing. And so the women's police stations, the training would center on understanding that misogyny is a part of the role in violence against women. And so it would be captured in that aspect. But the way it would respond to misogyny in the RCMP would be potentially at some point, those individuals would hopefully not be responding to gender-based violence if it was still indeed in there. And I don't know if that's the best response, but that's the only one I have right now.
Thank you, Myrna. I think there's somebody Barbara, who said, would it be better to call them peace officers? I mean, I think that's an interesting concept. I do know that United Nations Women, and I do know that there's quite a similarity here because United Nations has established women's police keeping forces, and they've had to do that because the male peacekeepers in missions, unfortunately, we're taking advantage of very vulnerable women who are refugees, homeless, victims of, and this is an area that I'm not an expert in this, but certainly the UN has found that women peacekeepers in certain situations are a hell of a lot more trustworthy than men.
I think I would like to pop in here and say too that this issue came up in some of the qualitative responses too, and that people even just didn't want policing; they wanted to call it something else. Where other comments then said, well, if you remove the police label, sometimes the initiative would then get marginalized because often there's a certain hierarchy in responses that sees the policing sector as a primary sector. And so once we call it something different, it would get marginalized like other responses. So it's an interesting issue about if we continue to call it policing, if indeed it's police, the term police or policing, that's the problem in itself.
Yes. I know that in Argentina, the women police who we talk to, they wear uniforms, they have the same training, but they have a specialist training. They have all the same powers, but they have additional training, additional powers under the Act to engage in prevention. They are very keen that it is police. And the reason why they say it has to have police in the title is because we need to completely reimagine how police operate. We need to reimagine that police don't need to be, they can be trusted. It's about turning the concept of policing around from being almost in the enemy of the community to being trust-based, to being, and they need the authority of the state because, and they need to work there because a lawyer, a domestic violence worker, a sexual assault counselor, they can't go and remove an offender. They don't have the power to do that. So that's why they say police are absolutely critical to this, but they can't be asked to do everything, which is why they work in a group.
And I think, sorry, Kerry, I was just going to say, I think the reason as well for it to be policing is keeping front and centre the fact that violence against women is a crime. And I think, you know, it's about holding on to the fact that it's actually trying to hold people to account for behaviour that is illegal and needs to be dealt with in a justice system that's actually fair and not misogynistic. And I think that's very much from the recent calls and demonstrations in the UK. I don't know what Jackie and Mahuya think, but I think that's been very much about justice actually becoming focused on the concerns of women and not sidelining those or saying it will deal with them, but then actually failing to deal with them. So I think actually the concept of policing, even if we then do that in a way that is multi-agency focused and brings lots of people together, it's still actually about justice. I think justice is at the core of that.
Yeah, agree. Jackie, I'd like to get your take on that.
Be on mute this time. No, I absolutely agree. I think policing is one aspect of it, but certainly in the UK, there is the court and the judicial process as well. And, you know, I think sometimes we could give the best service to a female victim that walks through the door. We almost lose our control the second we get them to the court, and then suddenly they have a terrible experience in the court through the trial. So it's the whole justice system. It's all, and for me, a lot of the debate has been around women feeling safe out in the streets. But if you know, and the answer seems to be, we'll put some street lights up. Well, that's not actually solving the problem that women don't feel safe in the streets. So for me, as well as the court system, and of course, police need training and improving all of the time. And I think the UK are on a different trajectory. You know, we have learnt around coercive control. We've done extensive training around coercive control and domestic abuse. And all of our officers are specially trained on that, and are happy again to take any conversations offline with police colleagues if they want to talk about our experience. But for me, it's about education, and it's about respect, and it's about how we deal with each other in a respectful way, where and how the criminal justice system supports that respect that's needed in the community.
Okay. I don't know what's happened. I don't know how I can share my screen. I'm sorry, everybody, but I think that's all the questions we have in the chat. So Vanessa, can I get you to come in and wrap up? I'd just like to thank you all. And I think Vanessa will say thank you to everybody. And then I think I'll stop the recording. But thank you, everyone. Vanessa, do you want to wrap up?
Yes, well, sorry, Kerry. Yeah, well, thank you everyone for joining us for our discussion today. And I hope this has given everybody a bit more overview of reimagining policing moving forwards. There were the contact details at the end of the last slide, which I hope everyone got. But thank you all for attending. Thank you to all the team for all the great research that you have done. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, and I should say thank you very much to Vanessa, who prepared those slides for us all and made it there. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Vanessa. And I think you'll be hearing a lot more from us. I just particularly want to thank Jacqueline, and you're just a trailblazer. And I just wish you could get on the phone to our police commissioners in Australia and say, listen, why are you so frightened? Why can't you become part of the solution? I don't know why they don't want to, but unfortunately, most of them don't want to, and that is very unfortunate. And thank you to all our participants. And this will be available now. I will stop sharing and wish you all a very good day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.